In the autumn of 1944, as the Allied armies pushed steadily eastward, following their breakout from Normandy, the war on the Western Front entered a new and brutally unstable phase. American troops advancing into France found themselves confronting terrain and weather far harsher than anything they had faced during the summer. The Vosges Mountains, stretching across the Franco-German frontier, became a crucible where entire units struggled to advance through thick forests, razor-sharp ridgelines, mud-choked valleys, and sudden fog that could swallow a battalion whole. It was in this environment, months before the world-famous chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, that one of the least celebrated but most astonishing acts of individual courage in American military history unfolded. The man at the center of it did not fit Hollywood's idea of a warrior. He was not a towering figure with a fearsome reputation. He was not a rifleman groomed from youth to be a soldier. Instead, he was a 33-year-old Tennessee man with quiet features, a calm temperament, and a job title that suggested anything but heroics on the battlefield: Company Cook. Charles Henry Coolidge had grown up in the rural American South during the Depression, working odd jobs and learning to survive with very little. Before the war, he was not a man of great public ambition, nor did he have political aspirations, academic accolades, or a reputation as a brawler. He simply possessed the hardiness of a man who had worked outdoors, who knew the weight of labor, and who understood the quiet dignity of doing one's duty without seeking recognition. When drafted into the U.S. Army, Coolidge was assigned to Company M of the 36th Infantry Regiment, part of the 7th Infantry Division. Because of his age, his demeanor, and his reliability, he was often given logistical or support tasks rather than frontline assault duties. Eventually, he became the company's cook, a position that meant long hours, heavy lifting, and looking after the needs of hungry soldiers returning exhausted from patrols or firefights. What it did not mean, at least on paper, was direct combat. But the war did not care who someone was on paper. In October 1944, the American advance into the Vosges Mountains met stiff and unexpected resistance. The German army, particularly units associated with the 11th Panzer Division, had pulled back into the rugged highlands and established defensive networks designed to slow or halt American momentum. Infantry, engineers, machine gun detachments, and armored elements worked together to fashion a lethal combination of ambushes and counterattacks. These forces were experienced, disciplined, and supported by terrain ideally suited for defense. American units found themselves marching into forests where visibility dropped to almost nothing, where sound bounced strangely off trees and rock walls, and where the narrow trails could be mined, trapped, or covered by hidden enemy machine guns. It was in this zone, near the small French village of Beazlesburg, that Coolidge's company moved forward on what was supposed to be routine reconnaissance and positioning, nothing that suggested the extraordinary events about to unfold. As Company M pushed toward the wooded high ridge they were assigned to hold, they quickly realized they were not alone. German patrols shadowed their movements. Intermittent shots cracked in the distance. The terrain became tighter, the air colder. Reports filtered in of significant enemy troop movements to the east. Though no one could say precisely how many enemy soldiers were present or what their intentions were, line companies needed time to establish a proper defensive perimeter, to set up heavy weapons, and to assess the ground. Coolidge, who had joined the movement forward to support the men and help manage supplies, was not expected to be in the center of any major action. Yet fate had other plans. What began as a somewhat tense advance turned with startling speed into a crisis. On October 24, 1944, Company M encountered a large and determined German force that immediately launched attacks designed to overwhelm the American position. At first, the scale of the threat was unclear. Fire erupted from multiple directions. German voices echoed through the trees, and shells burst against the rocky ground. The company's machine gun team was hit almost immediately, leaving their Browning .30 caliber weapon unmanned. This machine gun was the linchpin of the company's defensive capability. Without it, the men were little more than scattered riflemen in the woods. Coolidge saw the gun fall silent. He saw the wounded gunner bleeding in the leaves, and without hesitation, the cook picked up the weapon, dragged it into a small depression along the ridge, and began firing. It is difficult to truly appreciate what this moment meant. Coolidge was not assigned to fight. He had no formal training as a machine gunner. He had no reason, beyond duty, to expose himself. But he understood that the collapse of the machine gun position would unravel the entire company. So he set the tripod as best he could in the mud and braced his shoulders behind the weapon, just as the German assault intensified. The gun roared to life, cutting through branches and sending bursts of tracers across the ravine. German troops, stunned to find the machine gun suddenly back in operation, broke into cover. Coolidge's bursts pinned down multiple enemy squads and disrupted the initial German advance. For a moment, the American line held, and Coolidge's steady fire along the tree line became the anchor point of the entire defense. What none of the Americans initially realized, and what Coolidge discovered only through the sheer weight of the attacks, was that they were facing an enemy force roughly 6 times their size. German infantry poured forward in waves, supported by heavy weapons and coordinated movement. These were not inexperienced troops. They were veterans accustomed to fighting in difficult terrain. As more German assaults were launched, Coolidge continued firing. When the barrel overheated, he swapped it under fire. When his belt of ammunition ran low, he crawled through the underbrush to retrieve more from fallen comrades. The air filled with the thunder of rifles, machine guns, grenades, and German mortars thumping in the distance. The shallow ditch Coolidge occupied became a focal point of destruction. As the hours dragged on, German troops made repeated attempts to flank or rush the machine gun nest. Coolidge responded each time with calm, controlled bursts. Other American soldiers later recalled that Coolidge's tone never changed. He spoke quietly, gave simple instructions, and reassured panicked men, even as explosions ripped open tree trunks just yards away. His steadiness prevented collapse. His firepower repelled advances. His willingness to expose himself gave others courage to stay in position. What was intended to be a short engagement had now evolved into something far more serious. And as Coolidge's lone machine gun position continued to thwart German attempts to break through, the enemy escalated their efforts. Those efforts, and Coolidge's response to them, would define the next chapters of this extraordinary battle. As the Allied advance pushed steadily through France during the autumn of 1944, the German army, bleeding men, fuel, and equipment, had begun to fall back toward the protective barrier of the German frontier. The Vosges Mountains, a tangled stretch of dense pine forests, steep ridges, and narrow valleys, became a natural defensive shield behind which German forces regrouped. For the Americans of the 36th Infantry Division and its attached units, this terrain was unlike anything they had encountered during the summer breakout. Every slope was a potential ambush, every ridgeline a concealed firing position, and every village a fortified node in a larger defensive system. Small patrols became large engagements with little warning. Supply routes were constantly harassed by enemy fire, and communication lines were constantly threatened by German infiltration teams. It was in this unforgiving, claustrophobic environment that Technical Sergeant 5th Grade Charles Henry Coolidge, a soft-spoken Tennessee soldier serving as a company cook, found himself thrust from routine duty into one of the most extraordinary small unit stands of the European War. Coolidge had earned the respect of his unit long before the German attack. Although a cook by duty roster, he had repeatedly volunteered for frontline support, carrying ammunition, tending to wounded men, and acting as a steady presence for younger soldiers shaken by the intensity of the Vosges campaign. His manner was calm, almost disarmingly gentle. He rarely raised his voice, and his drawl carried the slow, deliberate phrasing of someone who spoke only when necessary. Men trusted him immediately. His steadiness under fire, his willingness to help anyone who needed it, and his reassuring refusal to panic made him an unofficial anchor in the company. Yet nothing in his demeanor hinted at the ferocity he would display when compelled to fight for his life and the lives of those around him. On the morning of October 24, 1944, Company M was moving through a wooded slope near the village of Bieselsberg, tasked with probing German lines and determining whether the terrain ahead held significant resistance. The area had been contested repeatedly for weeks. Both sides had exchanged ground several times, and intelligence on enemy positions was vague. Fog hung between the trees, muting sound and visibility. Patrol leaders expected scattered rifle fire or a small outpost, nothing more. But as the patrol approached a narrow clearing, the forest suddenly erupted with machine gun fire, mortars, and small arms bursts. Hidden German forces, later identified as elements of the 11th Panzer Division, including infantry and engineers, had set up a layered defensive trap. They had chosen their ground well. The Americans were channeled into an exposed segment of the slope, while the Germans were positioned higher, firing downhill from dug-in emplacements concealed by thick undergrowth. The first bursts cut down several American soldiers before they could find cover. Confusion rippled through the patrol as the sudden ambush overwhelmed the element of control. Coolidge, who had been moving near the front, immediately crawled toward a fallen machine gun team. One man was dead, the other wounded and unable to fire. Coolidge pulled the Browning .30 caliber machine gun from the dead gunner's hands, dragged the tripod toward a shallow depression in the ground, and set up his firing position under a rain of bullets. The Germans, believing they had caught a vulnerable American patrol in the open, surged forward to exploit the advantage. Coolidge's machine gun opened up, sending precise, disciplined bursts across the slope. His fire was not wild. Every burst was controlled, every belt change executed with calm efficiency. The Germans did not know a company cook was the one fueling this sudden defensive wall. They only knew the American fire was unexpectedly strong, breaking up their advance and preventing them from securing the clearing. What followed was not a quick skirmish, but the beginning of a grinding 36-hour ordeal. German forces attempted repeated assaults, shifting their angles of attack, adjusting their positions, and calling forward additional infantry. Coolidge's position became the central anchor for the American defense, because it lay at the one point on the slope from which the machine gun could command the main avenue of approach. Every attack was met with the same steady burst of fire. Soldiers lying beside him later recalled that he never raised his voice beyond a quiet command, never cursed, never muttered about being pinned down. He simply worked the machine gun, adjusted the sights, changed belts, and fired. Over time, the depression he occupied grew into a shallow trench carved out by bullets and shrapnel. At several points, the gun barrel overheated, glowing faintly in the cold air. Coolidge let it cool long enough to avoid a jam before resuming fire. When ammunition began to run low, he crawled forward under fire to retrieve belts from dead or wounded soldiers, dragging them back to his makeshift foxhole. Mortar fire bracketed the position repeatedly, sending earth and metal fragments into the air. Splinters tore his uniform, grazed his skin, and peppered the stock of the machine gun, but he remained at his post. Other soldiers rotated in and out, some wounded, others too exhausted to continue. But Coolidge held his position continuously. His determination became contagious. More Marines and infantrymen rallied to support the line, precisely because he held it without hesitation. The German officers coordinating the assault soon realized they were dealing with more than a stalled patrol. They brought forward additional infantry squads and machine gun teams, attempting to flank the position. Coolidge adjusted his fire accordingly, shifting the tripod, changing elevation, and issuing quiet, steady instructions. His fire broke up flanking movements and forced the Germans to fall back repeatedly. The attackers came within yards of his trench at several points, shouting, firing, and throwing grenades. Several grenades landed close enough to shower him with soil and fragments, yet he continued to fire until the enemy retreated again. As daylight faded and darkness settled in, the forest transformed into a maze of shadows and flickering muzzle flashes. Coolidge's machine gun continued to speak in short bursts, marking his position like a lighthouse in the chaos. Through the night and into the next morning, the pattern repeated. A German push, a sustained burst of American fire from Coolidge's position, and a retreat back up the slope. By dawn on the second day, the Americans had stabilized their perimeter, but the Germans launched one more coordinated assault, this time bringing forward armored vehicles. Coolidge's response was immediate. He raked the advancing vehicles with machine gun fire, targeting exposed infantry and the vulnerable aspects of the armored hulls. He reportedly disabled at least 2 vehicles with accurate fire, forcing the remaining armor to fall back. By the end of the 36-hour engagement, German forces began to withdraw from the immediate area, uncertain how many Americans they had faced and stunned that their calculated ambush had failed to break through. When reinforcements finally arrived and Coolidge relinquished his gun, he simply nodded, exhausted but steady, as though the previous day and a half had been nothing more than a routine shift. For the men whose lives he had saved, the sight of him standing quietly beside the machine gun was unforgettable. A cook who had become, for those desperate hours, the immovable center of their survival. As the fight near Beazlesburg intensified through the late morning, the German forces adjusted their strategy, shifting from probing attacks to more concentrated thrusts intended to collapse the American line through sheer numerical weight. The Germans understood that the shallow ridge occupied by Coolidge's men was the last meaningful barrier before the terrain fell sharply toward the rear of the 36th Infantry Regiment's defensive zone. If they broke through here, they could unhinge the American flank, roll downhill into the supply and command elements, and potentially turn a contained engagement into a divisional-level crisis. The importance of this ground, insignificant on a map, yet decisive in its placement, forced Coolidge into a position he never sought but refused to abandon. His men were scattered through tree lines and foxholes, improvised shelters and ditches, and the Germans used every fold of terrain to press closer. Mortar rounds bracketed the slope, machine gun bursts tore through the branches overhead, and small arms fire echoed in bursts as both sides tried to feel out weaknesses. Coolidge's machine gun position quickly became the axis of resistance. When the first German squad attempted to flank from the left using a wooded draw, he shifted the .30 caliber gun and laid down fire that cut across the foliage, sending the attackers scrambling back down the hillside. The gun overheated repeatedly, requiring him to swap barrels or pause momentarily. But each time he got it running again, the rhythm of controlled bursts resumed. His method of firing was deliberate rather than frantic, a steady pattern that kept the enemy pinned without wasting precious ammunition. German reports later indicated they believed multiple American machine gun crews were engaging them. In reality, it was the calm precision of a single cook with a single gun. His unit's riflemen, spread thin and relying on him to hold the center, were able to reposition or dig in more securely because his fire never wavered. When German reinforcements arrived, elements believed to belong to the 11th Panzer Division's infantry detachment, they brought heavier weaponry and greater organization. Grenadiers attempted a coordinated push supported by light mortars, hoping to storm the American position before a larger counteraction could be arranged by U.S. command. They advanced in bounding teams, moving from tree to tree, using ruined stone walls for cover, and probing with rifle grenades. Coolidge spotted them gathering near a thicket roughly 150 yards to his right and shifted his fire again. The team carrying the squad's light machine gun went down almost instantly. The rest of the formation hesitated, scattered, and momentarily dissolved into the trees, unsure how many American automatic weapons were targeting them. Throughout this period, the Germans attempted to communicate demands for surrender. Using English and amplified by the terrain, they shouted challenges up toward the ridge, urging the Americans to lay down their weapons. Coolidge responded exactly once, yelling back that if they wanted the Americans to surrender, they could come and get them. After that brief exchange, the Germans stopped trying to negotiate. They began preparing for a heavier assault, likely realizing the defenders were fewer in number than they originally assumed. With increasing waves of pressure, the ridge became a magnet for German infantry. Coolidge and the few men able to operate nearby weapons had to rotate tasks, drag ammunition belts through mud, and redistribute rifle clips among the scattered foxholes. Coolidge himself several times crawled into dangerous terrain to retrieve ammunition from fallen soldiers or abandoned packs. Each time, he exposed himself to fire in order to keep the machine gun active. The Germans noted his movements and attempted to kill him specifically, recognizing that silencing the gun would break the backbone of the defense. In mid-afternoon, the Germans made their most concentrated attempt to overrun the position. Using smoke grenades and covering fire, they approached to within grenade range from multiple angles. Coolidge, seeing figures pushing through drifting smoke, fired into the movement, sweeping the ground at waist height. Several attackers fell, but more kept coming. The Americans threw grenades back and forth in brief exchanges. One German soldier reached a point only yards away, throwing a grenade that landed barely short of Coolidge's ditch. He kicked it aside, buried himself momentarily against the ground as it detonated, and returned fire almost immediately. Riflemen to his left and right attempted to reinforce the gun, but the concentration of German pressure forced them to reposition or withdraw slightly, placing even more of the burden on him. The smoke cleared gradually, revealing German bodies scattered in the underbrush and others retreating to regroup farther downslope. The fighting dragged into evening with no letup. The dense woods magnified sound, making it difficult to distinguish between actual approach and the echoes of distant firefights. Coolidge's position had become a nerve center for the entire line. Runners carrying field notes or ammunition passed through his ditch, taking advantage of the relative safety created by the gunfire. Officers issued low-voiced instructions, warning that the enemy was massing again for a possible night assault. Coolidge barely slept. instead cleaning the weapon, repositioning ammunition, and keeping watch. The men around him depended on the stability he projected. He spoke plainly and calmly, keeping younger soldiers steady, even as the forest filled with shadows and scattered gunfire. The next morning brought renewed German pressure. Fresh infantry units, supported by engineers and at least one armored element, appeared along the tree line. Tank tracks could be heard grinding through the forest floor, a sound that unnerved many of the defenders. When a German medium tank, likely a Panzer IV, emerged through the trees, its hull camouflaged with branches, it advanced toward Coolidge's position in short jolts. Coolidge held his fire until the tank was committed. Then, using armor-piercing, .30 caliber rounds where possible, he aimed at exposed crew and external fittings, scoring hits that damaged its coaxial mount. When infantry attempted to follow behind the armor, he cut them down. The tank, unable to advance effectively up the embankment under such fire, withdrew slightly. This pattern repeated multiple times. At one point, the tank elevated its gun and fired into the trees above, attempting to scatter shrapnel downward on the American defenders. Coolidge again repositioned under fire, shifting his weapon to a fresh angle and continuing until the infantry accompanying the tank broke off the attack. When a second armored vehicle attempted to flank the position, Coolidge switched to rifle grenades after determining the machine gun would be ineffective. Crawling under fire to a better throwing angle, he fired at close range with remarkable accuracy. One grenade exploded directly near the tank's track assembly, causing enough damage to halt its movement. Smoke and steam vented from the vehicle as its crew abandoned it. This small victory, in the context of a much larger campaign, underscored how Coolidge's determination prevented the collapse of the ridge and deprived the Germans of a critical breakthrough pathway. Through all of this, Coolidge remained steady, maintaining his weapon as though performing the routine tasks of his role as a cook, calm, methodical, unfazed. Yet the effects of the battle grew increasingly visible. His uniform was torn, mud caked to his hands and arms, and the recoil of the machine gun bruised his shoulder. The Germans, realizing time was against them and that reinforcements were likely approaching, shifted to heavier mortar fire and indirect weapons. Craters scarred the slope, trees splintered, and the sound of constant concussions disrupted communication across the line. Still, he refused to withdraw. By the end of the 36-hour period, the German attacks had tapered as their casualties mounted and their momentum failed. When American reinforcements finally arrived, pushing the Germans back and reinforcing the ridge, they found Coolidge still at his post, exhausted, dirty, but composed. His machine gun was nearly out of ammunition, yet he remained alert enough to brief incoming officers on enemy positions, routes of approach, and the status of the men around him. The battle that might have turned the flank of an entire regiment had instead been held by a man whose original assignment was to prepare meals, not hold off an estimated 500 enemy soldiers. As the fighting intensified through the late morning and into the afternoon of October 24, 1944, the wooded ridge outside Beazlesburg transformed from an observation point into a crucible of survival. The initial German probing assault had already revealed that the enemy was not merely testing the American line, but preparing a coordinated attempt to punch through it. Charles Henry Coolidge, still technically the company cook of Company M, found himself standing, not behind supply tables or field stoves, but at the heart of a tactical bottleneck, where fewer than 30 American infantrymen were all that prevented a German breakthrough. The uneven terrain of the Vosges Mountains, with its dense tree lines, cold wind, and muddy slopes, created a setting in which visibility changed by the minute, where a squad could vanish behind a ridge and reappear only when muzzle flashes betrayed their position. Even after hours of combat, neither side held a clear advantage, yet the Germans maintained numerical superiority and a relentless willingness to press the attack. Throughout the day, the German infantry increased their use of suppressive fire, employing rifle grenades, machine gun bursts, and small mortar teams that targeted Coolidge's makeshift ditch. Their effort was methodical, not chaotic. First, they tried to isolate Coolidge's position, then to overwhelm the flanks, and finally to push directly into the ditch itself. Coolidge responded to each adjustment with the same brutal practicality he had shown from the start. The Browning .30 caliber machine gun, now hot enough that its barrels shimmered with heat distortion, became an extension of his will. Each time German troops probed through the trees, he swept fire into their ranks. Each time they tried to reinforce a fresh foothold on the slope, he shifted, adjusted his elevation, and broke their momentum. The steady rhythm of the Browning firing, pausing for reloads, and firing again became a mechanical counterpoint to the shouted German commands echoing through the forest. His platoon, pinned behind rocks and tree trunks, rallied around the courage they saw in Coolidge's unbroken defense. Several men later testified that his presence alone prevented panic. Coolidge shouted instructions when needed, called out visible movement, and urged his men to conserve ammunition and coordinate fields of fire. Despite the chaos around him, he remained astonishingly composed, even cracking dry jokes while rounds snapped above his head. That demeanor did more than steady the platoon. It created cohesion. Men who might otherwise have withdrawn under the weight of pressure instead held the ridge because Coolidge held it first. As night fell, the Germans adjusted their tactics once more. They stopped direct assaults and shifted toward attrition, probing the line with small teams to identify weaknesses. Sporadic bursts of fire crackled through the darkness, accompanied by shouted orders in German and the metallic clatter of weapons being repositioned. Coolidge, operating his machine gun by touch and memory, continued to fire controlled bursts when he identified silhouettes moving through the trees. His hands were raw from handling the overheated weapon. His uniform was torn from scrambling between positions. Yet he kept working through the darkness with methodical endurance, refusing to surrender the ground that had become the linchpin of the American defense. By dawn on October 25th, the German command escalated the assault significantly. 2 armored vehicles, light tanks or assault guns, depending on later interpretations, advanced toward Coolidge's position under covering fire from the forest line. Their engines roared through the valley, their tracks grinding through wet earth, signaling a clear intention to break the remaining American resistance through shock and armor. Coolidge, recognizing that the machine gun alone would be ineffective at stopping armored vehicles, shifted his focus to the infantry moving alongside and behind the advancing armor. He instructed nearby riflemen to stay concealed until the tanks closed the distance, so that their grenades and rifle grenades might have a chance of disabling exposed mechanics or external systems. The German tank crews seemed confident as they approached, likely expecting the Americans to scatter under the threat of armor. Instead, they found themselves facing the same stubborn defense that had denied the infantry for nearly a full day. As the lead tank closed within 30 yards of Coolidge's ditch, he dropped the machine gun momentarily, reached for a bazooka handed off by a nearby soldier, and prepared to fire. When he pulled the trigger, the weapon malfunctioned. A second bazooka was brought forward. It too failed. Coolidge, visibly irritated by the mechanical failure, simply shouted at the German tank commander, "Come on in, I'll take you on." The tank halted, perhaps unsure whether it faced hidden anti-tank weapons, and then reversed slightly before repositioning. Coolidge immediately resumed suppressive fire on the accompanying infantry, breaking their formation and forcing them to scramble for cover. For hours more, the Germans tried to seize the ridge. They launched small flanking teams that attempted to crawl within grenade distance. They tried to use trees as cover to advance machine gun posts. They called forward additional riflemen who fired at Coolidge's ditch in concentrated volleys. Each attempt was met with Coolidge's fire, precise, deliberate, and unbroken. By mid-morning, the German officers realized that the cost of taking the ridge was rising far beyond expectation, and their infantry was losing cohesion under repeated failed assaults. Only when American reinforcements finally arrived did Coolidge allow himself to ease his grip on the machine gun. For 36 hours, he had fought without relief, operating a heavy weapon meant for a crew of 2 or 3, under cold rain, exploding mortar fragments, creeping armor, and overwhelming numbers. When ordered to withdraw to reorganize with the fresh units coming forward, he calmly picked up the machine gun, slung it, and walked back down the slope. His uniform was soaked, his hands burned, and his face streaked with mud and exhaustion. The ridge he left behind was littered with spent casings, broken branches, and craters, silent proof of the impossible task he had somehow completed. The aftermath of the stand revealed just how much Coolidge's effort had mattered. German forces had not only failed to take the ridge, they had been prevented from executing a flanking maneuver that would have struck deeper into American lines. Coolidge's resistance had bought time, slowed momentum, and destabilized a key German attack effort during one of the most volatile phases of the Vosges campaign. Commanders reviewing the battle noted that without his stand, the unit's withdrawal might have become a rout, and the entire defensive arrangement on that part of the front could have collapsed. What stood out most among those who witnessed the fight was not simply his technical skill, nor his refusal to yield, but the unusual calm and even humor with which he faced what should have been certain death. It was a composure rooted not in bravado, but in the habitual resilience of a man who had lived a hard life long before the war. One who had worked fields, raised a family, faced personal hardship, and learned to meet crisis without panic. This combination of steadiness and grit had turned an ordinary cook into the immovable cornerstone of a defensive line under extraordinary pressure. In the hours following the withdrawal from the ridge, Coolidge's actions became the subject of immediate field reports, after-action analysis, and quiet word of mouth among the men who had held the line with him. His fellow infantrymen, many of whom had been pinned down or cut off during the height of the fighting, described him as the difference between their survival and annihilation. Officers, upon learning that the cook with the machine gun had single-handedly held off multiple waves of infantry and armored support, initially assumed the accounts were exaggerated. After interviewing survivors, reviewing the terrain, and studying the traces of German movement, they concluded that the reality was just as remarkable as the stories emerging from the front. Despite his commanding performance, Coolidge made no effort to call attention to himself. Upon returning from the line, he shrugged off praise, gave brief answers when questioned, and directed credit toward the platoon as a whole. Soldiers in his company later recalled that he quietly cleaned the machine gun, checked on the wounded, and resumed normal duties without treating the battle as anything unusual. That humility became an integral part of how his story was preserved, a tale of overwhelming courage set against the backdrop of a man who never sought recognition and who rarely spoke of the event afterward. In the weeks that followed, the broader campaign in the Vosges continued to evolve. American units struggled through forests, ravines, and entrenched German pockets that turned each advance into a costly contest. Although major offensives soon shifted elsewhere, the memory of Coolidge's stand lingered. The ridge where he had made his desperate defense became a reference point, an example used by leaders to emphasize the impact that individual resolve could have in larger tactical operations. Even after the campaign moved deeper into Europe, Coolidge's name appeared in documents outlining exceptional conduct in the field. The Army began the Medal of Honor review process quietly, as was common during ongoing operations, gathering statements from Coolidge's platoon, company officers, battalion staff, and nearby units that had observed the battle. Their accounts consistently emphasized two central themes: the overwhelming numerical disadvantage under which Coolidge fought, and the fact that his actions had prevented a dangerous German advance from gaining momentum. Witnesses noted his calmness under direct fire, his unbroken control of the situation, and his ability to direct fire and repel attacks with complete disregard for